I've always been someone who sought calm, far from the city lights and the noise of crowds. When I found that old house on the hill, surrounded by dense fog that never seemed to dissipate, I knew it was the perfect place to restart my life. The price was below average, which made me question whether I was making the right choice, but my gut told me to ignore any concerns. I needed peace, not answers. It was an imposing house, with tall windows and aged wooden doors. The garden was overgrown, covered in dry leaves and creeping vines that had invaded the stone wall. Yet, there was something alluring about its decay. I entered through the front door, and darkness enveloped me. The smell of mildew and rotting wood filled the air. There was a profound silence, as if the house knew I was an intruder. The first night was quiet, but a strange sensation lingered in the air. The sounds of the house seemed alive, as if it was breathing with every creak of the floorboards. I told myself it was just the wind, or perhaps the natural sounds of an old building. But as the night wore on, the feeling that I wasn't alone grew stronger. When I closed my eyes, the sounds of the house seemed to grow louder. Creaks and groans came from within the walls, as if someone was moving through the corridors. I got up, trying to ignore the growing fear in my chest. I went to the window and looked out at the field beyond. The fog was thick, swallowing everything in its path, making the night feel darker and more lifeless. When I returned to bed, something caught my eye, a painting on the wall. It was an old portrait of a woman with a vacant stare. Her eyes followed me, as if they were fixed on me, even when I moved. I decided to get up and take the painting down, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I touched it, a chill ran down my spine. The painting felt unnaturally warm, much warmer than it should have been. When I pulled it away from the wall, something strange happened. One of the floorboards shifted, making a high-pitched sound. My heart raced. When the painting fell to the floor with a loud crash, a cold wind blew through the room as if the house was exhaling. The painting lay there, but as I bent down to pick it up, what I saw made my stomach churn. The back of the painting was marked with something that looked like writing by hand. The words were covered in dust, faded by time, but when I focused, I could make out the message.
"He's coming."
I froze. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Was this a sick joke or was there something more? But one thing I knew for sure, I wasn't alone anymore. And that night, something else moved in the house. Something that shouldn't have been there. In the following days, I tried to remain calm. I was aware that my nerves might be getting the best of me, and that isolation could be affecting me more than I realized. The house was old, the air heavy and stagnant. The walls creaked with the wind, and the wood of the floor groaned, but this could all be explained, right? It was an old building, a structure that had lived through many stories. But as the days went by, the sounds and sensations began to feel like more than just coincidences. It was as if the house had a personality of its own, one that didn't want to be ignored. On the fourth night, after a long day of trying to keep myself occupied with small tasks, I lay down and closed my eyes. The darkness of the house seemed to solidify around me, like a heavy, impenetrable blanket. I wasn't sure where the night ended, and the house began. The air was thick, heavier than ever, and the smell of mildew was unbearable. I could feel a pressure on my chest, as if something was watching me, assessing me. I opened my eyes quickly, but nothing was visible, only the shadows, darker than ever. Then I heard it, the sound of slow, dragging footsteps coming from somewhere deep within the house. I froze. There was no one else here. I knew that. But the steps continued, uninterrupted, as if someone was walking through the hallways. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the sound didn't stop. I knew it wasn't in my head. It was real. Something was moving. Something was getting closer. I got out of bed, my feet barely making a sound on the old floorboards. The light from my flashlight flickered, as if it too was afraid to illuminate whatever was there. I followed the footsteps, which now seemed to be louder, more defined. But when I turned the corner into the main hall, everything was empty. There was nothing, no explanation, no presence, only the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. My mind started playing tricks on me. I was becoming more paranoid, but then something caught my eye. Looking back at the painting that had fallen to the floor, I saw something new. The message wasn't the same. The words that were once written by hand, faded and old, now seemed different.
"He's coming?"
Had transformed into something bigger, something more detailed.
"He's inside of you."
I froze again. How could this be happening? How could something be inside me? I looked around the room, and that's when I noticed it. The shadows were moving again. They didn't move like normal shadows. They stretched and shrank, as if something was pulling them, manipulating them. Every shadow on the wall seemed to want to stretch toward me, pulling me into its grasp. The temperature dropped as if the air itself was freezing. The weight of the presence around me grew stronger, more suffocating. I went to the window, trying to distance myself from whatever was happening inside the house. But outside, the fog was thicker than ever. I could barely see anything beyond the edge of the house. The fog swallowed everything, and the night seemed darker, more oppressive. The house, it seemed, was closing in on itself, as if it was swallowing me whole. I needed to leave, I needed to get out. But before I could make any move, I heard something even more disturbing, the sound of my name being whispered. I froze again. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, muffled and distant, as if it was coming from all corners of the house.
You can't leave.
The voice murmured, with a dark and unmistakable authority.
You can't leave.
There was no one there. Nothing but the house and me, but the words were clear, I couldn't escape. Suddenly the shadows began to move more violently. They weren't just stretching across the walls anymore. They were forming, becoming more solid, taking on shapes. I didn't know what it was, but something told me that I couldn't be here when it happened. The massive shadows began moving toward me, stretching and distorting, as if they were becoming something more. The house wasn't just old, it was something else. It was alive. And now, it wanted me. The air in the basement felt like it had solidified into something dense and heavy. Every breath I took became more difficult, as if the very air was being sucked out by some invisible force. The light from the flickering lamp above cast a weak, trembling glow over the objects scattered around, but the darkness that enveloped the room seemed to swallow it all. It was as if the house itself was trying to devour the light. I found myself paralyzed, not knowing if I should press forward or run away from this place. But something, some twisted instinct, was pulling me deeper into it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe terror. But something was dragging me toward the center of that basement, where the table covered in a dark cloth stood. I knew that whatever lay beneath it would reveal more than I was capable of understanding. I hesitated for a moment, but then, with impulsive determination, I pulled the cloth away. The fabric was old and it came off easily, revealing a figure that looked as though it had been there for ages. At first glance, it seemed like a grotesque sculpture, perhaps made of wax or some other material. But as I drew closer, I saw it was a body, a human body, pale and lifeless, with its eyes shut and an expression of eternal pain etched into its face, as if it had been trapped in suffering forever. Its neck was twisted unnaturally, its fingers curled in an agonizing, desperate pose. But what truly froze me wasn't the corpse or the grotesque marks on its body. It was the symbol carved into its chest. It was the same symbol from the painting, the same writing.
He's coming. He's inside of you.
The message was carved into the skin, marking the body as if it were the house's own confession. I couldn't breathe. It was like the house had orchestrated this moment for me to see, to know the terrible truth. I didn't know if this was real or if my mind was breaking down. My body froze. Then I heard it again. That whisper. That cold, unmistakable voice.
You can't leave.
The voice was now closer, more intense, as if the house itself was speaking to me, pulling me into its darkness. I wanted to run, but there was no way out. There was nothing left but the shadows creeping closer, the walls closing in. The shadows started moving again. Not like before, when they simply stretched across the walls. They were now forming solid shapes, taking on more definition. The air grew colder still. It was as if the house was feeding on my terror, twisting reality around me. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her, the woman from the painting. She appeared in the doorway, standing motionless, watching me. Her vacant eyes followed every movement I made, but there was no recognition in them. There was only emptiness, no life, no emotion. Just the cold, unfeeling gaze of something that had existed for far too long. Something that had never left. I tried to speak, to shout, but the words wouldn't come. The air had thickened, pressing down on me, making it impossible to breathe. The house was suffocating me. The shadows, the presence, it all felt like it was one singular force, an unstoppable, all-consuming darkness. The woman stepped forward, her feet never touching the ground. Her movements were graceful but unsettling, like something that didn't belong in this world. I could feel the chill in the air growing even stronger as she came closer. And as she reached out her hand, I knew there was no escaping her, no escaping this house. I was already part of it. The shadows closed in around me, and the world seemed to blur. I was no longer standing, I wasn't even breathing. I was being pulled into the darkness, and I knew then that I would never escape. The house had claimed me, and I was now a part of it. There was no return, no hope.
You are mine now.
The woman whispered, her voice merging with the darkness. And I knew then that I would never leave. I no longer knew when the house stopped being a physical structure and became something far beyond comprehension. Every second I spent inside it, the walls seemed to close in on me, becoming more threatening, more suffocating. The feeling of claustrophobia intensified with every breath I took, as if the air itself were being drained by an invisible force. The silence was absolute, but it was the kind of silence that reverberated, that pressed against my mind, as if something was lurking, waiting. I was submerged in a thick darkness, as though the house itself was feeding off my anxiety, creating an even more oppressive atmosphere. The cold seeped into my veins, freezing every movement I tried to make. Every muscle in my body was tight, resistant to every step, as if the house itself were physically restraining me from moving forward. I didn't know if it was fear holding me back, or if the house itself was literally trapping me here, forcing me to stay. Then, as if everything was part of some grand design, the shadows moved again. They weren't ordinary shadows, the kind light could dispel. They crawled across the walls, across the floor, contorting, becoming denser, and with every movement they made, the house seemed to pulse as though it were alive, breathing, absorbing everything around it. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was just my mind, but the shadows started to become more defined. They stretched along the walls, twisted around the ceiling, moving with an unnerving synchronization. I was being watched, not by something, but by everything. The house itself seemed to be staring at me, as if each brick, each beam of wood, each inch of this place knew who I was. I no longer knew if I was standing, if I was fallen, or if I was simply frozen at the center of a spiral, pulling me into the depths of its darkness. And then, when my vision began to blur, the woman from the painting appeared in front of me. Not suddenly, but like a presence growing slowly from the darkness. I recognized her instantly, with her empty stare and her smile that was wide yet void. She was standing in front of me, motionless. Her silhouette was blurred, as if made of mist or smoke. I was hypnotized. Even without speaking, her presence was overwhelming. It was as if I were being consumed by something far larger than myself. I had no control. There was no space left. She reached out one of her hands, slowly, as if time had slowed around her. Her fingers were long and thin, and when she extended them toward me, I knew there was no return. The silence around us became deafening. Her hand reached out, and I knew exactly what she wanted from me. I knew what it meant. What? The shadows around me began to stir more violently. They were no longer just surrounding me. They were moving into me, penetrating me. I could feel something dissolving inside me, as if I were being melted into the house. My consciousness was fragmenting, dissolving between the walls and corridors of the house. I no longer knew where my mind ended and the darkness began. I no longer knew what was real. I wanted to scream, to resist, but a force far stronger than me enveloped me, keeping me in this place, in this space. The feeling of being pulled into that darkness, of being absorbed by it, was overwhelming. I no longer could distinguish the woman's figure from the house itself. She was the house was her, and I was no longer me. Then, in the farthest corner of the room, something moved. Not a figure, not a shape, but a presence. Something larger, something waiting. And then, when I finally saw it, the mass of shadows took shape. A figure that was larger than anything I could imagine emerged from the darkness. I knew with a terrible certainty that it was him, not a man, not a spirit. It was the darkness itself personified, the void made flesh, a manifestation of what the house truly was. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was everything. When he approached, the house moved. The walls seemed to bend, distort, as if the house were preparing to receive the new form, the new essence it desired to claim. I was being pulled into him. There was no escape. There was no space for resistance. He was already in me, around me, in every piece of this house, in my soul. And when he finally touched me, I felt true darkness. Not a fleeting fear, not a sense of imminent death, but a sensation of total and complete absorption. It was as if I were becoming part of an endless cycle, part of something far greater than I could ever understand. I no longer existed as an individual. I had become part of the house, part of the void. The last thing I heard was a whisper, coming from all directions, from the whole house, a sigh that spread, filling every room.
Now you'll never leave.
And with that, the house returned to silence. But it was not an empty silence, it was the silence of eternity. It waited, patiently, for another chosen one to approach. I was just a shadow now, within the walls of the house, a shadow waiting quietly for the next to be consumed, and the cycle continued.